What's up guys, welcome to episode 2 of Iconic Tone. In the first episode we covered Slash's iconic Appetite for Destruction tone using a Les Paul and Marshall style amp tones, but today we're going in the complete opposite direction to chase the Stevie Ray Vaughan tone on his song Lenny. And to do that, of course, we need a Strat and some sort of Fender or Dumble style amp or amp simulation. Now, this series is not about replicating the tone using the exact same rig as the original artist, which would be outrageously expensive and extremely loud in this particular case. It's more about teaching you how you can chase these iconic tones using the gear that you already own, whether that's a modular, a plugin, or a combo amp with pedals. What I'm using for my tone today is the Archetype Corey Wong plugin from Neural DSP, who are the sponsor of today's video. After watching this, you can try my tone out for free instantly by downloading your trial of the plugin and my Lenny preset, the links to which are in the description box. Now let's get started by learning about the Stevie Ray Vaughan sound. So Stevie was famous for using Fender amps, namely vibroverbs and super reverbs, but he also used a Dumble steel string singer, which was a 150 watt clean amp and a huge part of his sound really. I also didn't realize this until recently, but apparently he had a Marshall major heads in his rig as well. Of course, we all know that the Ibanez TS-808 Tube Screamer was a crucial part of his lead sound, and he was no stranger to using very, very heavy strings. That being said, I am not going to be using the inbuilt Tube Screamer emulation on the Corey Wong plugin today, and I'm also not using 13 gauge strings. I've got Ernie Ball 10 to 46 on my Strat today. I usually use 11s, but I ran out and had some 10s laying around. I think people really overestimate how much the heavier gauge strings affected his tone, personally anyway. Yes, there is a difference, but man, the trade-off in finger pain is just not worth it to me. So I'm going to give you guys some tips for emulating the Lenny sound that will apply to any rig that you happen to own. And tip number 1 is aim for edge of breakup. So the edge of breakup sound is what happens when you take an amp that doesn't have a lot of clean headroom and you turn the volume up to the point where it starts to transition from clean to dirty. How I've achieved this in Archetype Corey Wong is I'm using the amp snob head, which is conveniently modeled after a Dumble amp. And I'm actually using the dirty channel because to my ears, the clean channel doesn't get close enough to SRV territory. But I've got the volume on the amp set just shy of a quarter of the way up. And more importantly, I've got the input gain control of the plugin overall dialed back by around 11 dB or so, which gives me a little bit more clean headroom to play with. If I had the input set to 0 and turned the volume on the amp up a little bit higher, that would be way too much gain. So we're aiming for a slightly overdriven tone, and the way to test this is to have your guitar's volume all the way up, strum some chords really hard, and you should hear a bit of mild overdrive, but then play some licks with some very delicate dynamics and it should sound clean, like this for example. Tip number 2 is to set the EQ bright and heavy. Stevie's tone on Lenny has a lot of detail in the high end, but it never sounds ice picky. You know, it sounds bright but heavy at the same time. And I mean heavy in the sense that there's weight behind the notes. It's not thin sounding. So the way to go about dialing in the EQ is to be very generous with the bass, middle, treble, and presence controls on your amp or amp modular. If you look at my settings, all of those controls are 3/4 of the way up, but for you, that might just be half the battle. And what I mean by that is depending on your rig, it might still sound a bit too dark. And if that is the case, I would recommend either looking into a treble booster pedal or loading one up on your modular if you're using, you know, an HX Stomp or a Pod or an Axe FX, anything like that. Get a treble booster, or if your amp has one, use the bright switch. A treble booster will add a nice bit of high-end detail to your amp and a little bit of gain as well. And the bright switch on an amp will do something similar to your tone. I'm using the bright switch on the amp's knob head, and just to show you how much this affects the tone, I'll keep all of the settings so far the same, but turn off that bright switch. Now let's turn it back on. To my ears, the difference is night and day. Instantly, you get so much closer to the SRV sound with that added crispiness that the bright switch provides. Tip number 3 is something that you can skip over if you're not miking up an amp at home or if you're not using a modeler with mic emulations. It's all about microphone positioning. I really hate it when people place microphones directly on the center of the speaker cone. It just sucks all the low end out of the tone and results in this overly harsh sounding tone that I just can't stand. And because the EQ we just set for the Stevie sound is already very bright, in order to tame that brightness so that it doesn't hurt you or your audience's ears, you want to set your mic or mics closer to the edge of the speaker cones. At least this is how I like to do it. Let's listen to how it sounds with the microphones close to the center of the speaker cones. And now let's pull those mics back to the edge of the speakers. So we've got the amp set to edge of breakup, the EQ is dialed in, our mics are where they need to be, and tip number 4 is all about putting the finishing touches on the sound. Delay and reverb. Now, did Stevie use a delay on the original Lenny recording? I don't think so, but for my Lenny tone, I have the delay set up in a way that enhances the sound without you really noticing it, and let me explain what I mean by that. I've got it set for 1 repeat at 125 milliseconds with the mix set very low. So what this does is it creates essentially a slapback delay sound, but it's a very subtle slapback that's almost like you're emulating the reflection of a wall in a small venue. If I play chords, you won't really notice it, but when I switch to licks, you might hear the difference with it on. Now, when the reverb gets added in, it does sort of wash away that delay, but I still feel like it's doing something to thicken up the tone. So I like to keep that delay in there personally, even though I wouldn't say it's essential to the Stevie Lenny sound. As for reverb, it doesn't sound like spring reverb from an amp on the original recording, at least to my ears anyway. I could be wrong though, I'm not sure. I'm just using a fairly long decay with the mix set just before noon to get a nice lush Hall style reverb. Tip number 5 has nothing to do with gear, but everything to do with your hands, and it's use dynamics. Stevie was such a master of using dynamics to great effect. He would play small passages of licks really delicately, and then out of nowhere he would just smack the strings with a really strong heavy attack and then instantly go back to softer dynamics. And this is especially apparent on songs like Lenny and Riviera Paradise. You can take on board all of the tips that I've given you so far to do with gear and EQ and all that, but if you neglect to use dynamics in your playing, you are missing out. Who do you want me to cover in the next episode of Iconic Tone? Let me know by leaving a comment beneath the video. We've already had a ton of suggestions after the first Slash episode, but I'm always interested to hear more from you guys. Thank you for watching. I hope that this was helpful. If it was, please give it a like. If you're new, please subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.